Discovery class, good morning. Thank you for dropping by. Many years ago, this room here used to be my office. And I pastored Brentview for over a dozen years, from the mid-1970s right through to 1990. And during my watch, we had a very strong youth group. We still do. But in those days, our young people from college career through high school down through junior high, they were remarkable. I remember during my watch, we had 9 doctors come out of that youth group. And among them were engineers, we had nurses, we had teachers, a whole slew. Many of the students that would come, they came from immigrant families. And their parents, they snuck out of Russia and the Balkan states, and they got out just by the skin of their teeth. And when they came to Canada, they made a new life. And their young people, their children, came to Brentview. One of the couples had 3 boys. And when those boys came to our church, they were Lutheran. And I went to the mom and dad and I said, listen, mom and dad, you've got your 3 boys coming to our youth group and I don't want to take them away from your church. Oh, no, that's just fine, Ron, because we don't have any youth really for them. And what you're giving them, we're very thrilled with that. Well, one of the boys, when he got older, he attended the University of Calgary and he went on to become an engineer. He used my office. After I left, I'd clean the desk, leave the lights on, put on the coffee pot, and he would study. After he graduated, he went off into the oil and gas department of our city, and he became very successful as an engineer. After that, he became a teacher down at SAIT, and they really loved him at SAIT because the students voted him as their best teacher on the whole faculty. And I called it getting the golden pipe wrench. And the reason they liked him is because on his day off, on a Saturday, the students would come into his office, that is his classroom, invited by him and said, the exams are coming, I want all of you to pass. And you'll be very successful because I know what's on that exam, and I want you to be prepared. Those students, on his day off, would come, and there weren't any failures among all his students. His name is Harry Mackelberger, and I know Harry very well because I followed his life over the years. He married my secretary. I did the wedding. And now he has 2 children. They both have 2 degrees, and one's a teacher, and the other is in the executive office in one of the businesses. And here's Harry. I'm inviting him back today to talk to you because you got to meet a teacher, and you'll enjoy this. So pour yourself a coffee, get comfortable, sit back, and enjoy the company of Harry Mackelberger.
Thanks very much, Ron. Thanks for those kind words. I'm going to have to try to live up to that. And thank you to you for allowing me to come today and visit with you. Many of you have met me, and you know that I love to read. And I have a favorite bookstore. It's not far from the Peter Lougheed Hospital. And they sell the books really inexpensively, but the proceeds end up supporting a charity. So it's a great cause. But of course, the prices are really good. And I brought a couple of my favorite books along to show you in terms of some of the memories that are associated with them. This one is by Pierre Burton about the Klondike, and it's a favorite. It's incredibly interesting in terms of the hardships the miners went through in the late 1800s to go up to the Yukon. It was so far away from anything that it was quite an adventure just to get there, and then of course the mining. But it reminds me of Bob Giebert, who actually lived in the Yukon. So he and I would trade stories, especially after I read this book. And I definitely miss him. This one is called Nothing Too Good for a Cowboy. You may have seen the mini-series that CBC made out of it. Excuse me. And the story of this is a couple of Americans that came from somewhere in Wyoming and ended up in BC. And they started a ranch called the Frontier Cattle Company, one of the biggest ranches in BC. And when I think of what they went through in the 30s, no power, no vehicles, all on horseback, when they basically, between their muscle and the horses, they tamed the wilderness. And it's not unlike the stories that I've heard from people like Sam and Elsie Martins and Reg and Darlene Martin and Milton Linda Olhauser. A lot of people came from Europe, as Ron said, but a lot of people also came via the States where they tried to homestead there. And then as things got crowded, land became scarce, they came up to areas like Carbon and started farming and ranching. And of course, in the late 1800s, that's when the railway arrived in Calgary, 1883 actually, to be precise. And this book is called I'll Take the Train. It's not about trains so much, it's about the people who made the railroads run. And it's fascinating because if you think about it, when people like Sam and Elsie Martin first came to Alberta, or people maybe just before them, it might be a 3 day ride to get to Olds to visit some relatives. That was with if you had a good horse and if you had places to stop along the way. The train came, and all of a sudden you could go to Olds in 3 hours. So not all of it was necessarily good change, but the railway brought a huge amount of change, and we've benefited from the railway ever since. This one is called The Columbia is Coming, and it's about the Anglican Church in Vancouver and how they started a mission hospital on a ship up and down the coast, and then started some hospitals as well. A lot of the loggers and other people on the coast had no way to get to a hospital, so they brought the hospital to them. A fascinating book, and it talks about getting help sometimes from Vancouver, from some of the hospitals in Vancouver that would send doctors. Well, wouldn't you know it, I find a book called My Tales from My Little Black Bag, and it's by a doctor named John Ibbison, and it references he spent some time on the mission ship and in the hospitals on the West Coast. It's all in the book. As I was reading it, though, he comes to Calgary at one point in his career, and this is in the late 40s, and he sets up a practice on 17th Avenue and 14th Street. And I'm thinking, that's not far from where my family lived at the time. And then I'm thinking, Iberson, that name is familiar to me. Sure enough, I go to my mom and dad and ask them about it, and they said, yeah, he was our doctor. And it's a fascinating story of how he helped so many people. And so I'll come back to this book near the end of our talk today, because there's a really interesting story that comes out of this one. But one of my favorites is this one by by Norman Archer. He was a pastor here in Calgary for a while. He was also a pastor out in Victoria, and he wrote a book about King David. And David, we know, of course, killed Goliath and commanded armies and became king. But he had ups and downs, lots of them. His faith never wavered, and Norman Archer outlines that. So this became our book to use in our small group. And I have a wonderful small group. They're just amazing. If you're not in a small group, I recommend you get in one, because I, of course, go through the book. I learn some lessons out of it, and then I try to pass that on to the people in our group. And what's interesting is, you probably know, I get taught by them, and we learn together. And this was the basis of our book. One of the chapters in here deals with a topic that is kind of a tough one, and it's the topic of grief. And if we think back in the last year, even the last couple of weeks, it's been tough. It's been tough for many families. So there's some lessons in here. And what do you say to some of these people that you try to come alongside and try to comfort them? It seems like only yesterday that people in our youth group, Barry and Lois Updegrove, were married right here. It was June 13th, 1985. But now Barry, his daughters, his mom Shirley Friesen, and the rest of the family and friends, they're all trying to cope with this loss of the pain of losing Lois. How about Dan Nemes and his daughters? I don't know how they're going to manage after Gloria's passing recently. I still remember the joys of singing with Gloria in the choir, and I know I'm gonna need to come alongside Dan. And of course, as you know, I'm a talker. I like to chat, and I'm gonna have to try to just be quiet and come alongside him and ask him how he's doing. But we already have plans. It was a couple weeks ago that we talked about it. He and I are both motorcycle enthusiasts, and we've taken some trips together. We have a trip planned to his hometown near Swan Hills, Manitoba. So that's coming up hopefully in June or July. And I know that there may be times where he doesn't have much to say because of his grief, because it goes on quite a while, I'm told. In fact, in our small group, I was told that there's always that initial period of almost shock and confusion and hectic pace. And then there's a period where sometimes you feel all alone in your grief. And so in the weeks that follow, when someone is grieving, we need to come alongside and try not to say too much. Maybe just listen and ask how they're doing. I know that the celebration of life that we have makes a big difference. It helps. But even these days, we know that with the restrictions, we have to limit our gatherings. So I, like you, look forward to the day when we can have discovery class in person, when we can have bigger attendance at worship services, and when we can have gatherings. Let's have a look at the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, and let's read about grief. It's not a pleasant topic, but David had it. He went through it after the death of Saul. This is chapter 1, and it's the first 16 verses. It says, "After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. 'Where have you come from?' David asked him. He answered, 'I have escaped from the Israelite camp.' 'What happened?' David asked. 'Tell me.' He said, 'The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead.' Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, 'How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?' 'I happened to be on Mount Gilboa,' the young man said, 'and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and he said, "What can I do?" And I said, "What can I do?" He asked me, "Who are you?" "An Amalekite," I answered. Then he said to me, "Stand over me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive." So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes, and they tore them. They mourned and they wept, and they fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I'm the son of an alien, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his own men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and he died, for David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Now, those of you that have read 1 Samuel, and just a chapter back, you'll know that that this gentleman was lying. It looks like, we're not sure why, but it looks like he was trying to win favor with David by saying that he had killed Saul, in hopes that that might be a good thing. But David, of course, it was a harsh time. David responded with this guy losing his own life. But what's interesting, and in the book, Norman Archer, the book is called "David, When Only God's Grace Will Do." And David was a man that experienced grace time and time again. But it's interesting that, like a lot of us, when the news first comes, it could be after a long illness, it could be sudden, but it doesn't matter. It could be someone older, it could be someone younger. It's a shock. And when we first get that news, we are in shock. And Norman Archer suggests that maybe that's what's going on here. When somebody comes and reports what's happened in battle, and David asks a question that maybe isn't the best question. He says, "Well, how do you know?" He'd seen it. He'd seen the results. So for David to ask that question, it's probably that he was in a little bit of shock, which is not uncommon. When we first get bad news like that, we're in grief, we're in shock, and sometimes we say things we're not sure about, and we're often affected the same way. Now, it's possible that David sensed that the soldier wasn't being completely truthful, that he was fabricating something, or it could be that he was just trying to get more details. But it's quite possible that David was experiencing what we all do, which was a bit of shock. But you'll notice that it comes at the beginning of chapter 2 now in 2 Samuel. It says, "In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?' he asked. The Lord said, 'Go up.' David asked, 'Where shall I go?' 'To Hebron,' the Lord answered." So we see that there's that shock, there's that confusion, there's a lot of activity in the first stages of grief. But then later on, we have a sense that we need to kind of get back to work. We need to get back to maybe a new normal and try to get some normal happenings going on. And I think it's a natural tendency that we want to kind of get back to activity, get back to work. But it takes time. It takes sometimes months and sometimes years for some of the pain to subside. But you see that David wanted to kind of get back at it. So as we comfort the grieving, I think it's important to remember that initial shock, and then remember that there's a tendency to want to kind of get back to normal. But sometimes we need to come alongside those people and maybe even slow them down. And as one person in our group said, just ask them how they're doing, or send a text, send an email, um, drop off a meal, and some cases when we're allowed to, maybe outdoors, maybe share that meal. But of course, we sometimes tend to want to start talking and try to explain things away or to offer words of comfort. Sometimes we need to just come alongside and then see what the need is. An example that comes to mind for me, it wasn't so much a grieving. Well, I guess I was grieving. It wasn't it wasn't as serious as, of course, some people have had to go through. But what it was many of you may know that Brenda fell off of our roof quite a few years ago, and she landed on the driveway and broke her back and broke her ankle. Ended up in the hospital. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I won't go into all the details, but there were a lot of stressful situations in the emergency room for Brenda, for me, for the staff. It was tough, but finally it was close to midnight, and she had been admitted to her room in the Foothills Hospital. And my job was to kind of check to make sure that her toes, that she could wiggle her toes, because there was quite a bit of concern about the injury to her spine and spinal cord. And so things had finally slowed down after a tough evening, and I'm sitting in the room thinking I maybe should go home and pick up a few things for Brenda. And then I'm thinking, no, maybe I better stay here all night long. And I was just kind of weighing the options, and in walks one of the members of our small group. I'll never forget it. He didn't say much. He just, excuse me, I might get a little choked up. I still remember how tough it was. Um, he just sat down beside us in the hospital room and just said, how are you two doing? And then we talked to him and talked to him about some of the things that had gone on. And when he heard that I needed to go home, or thought I should go home, he said, well, I'll drive you. And I thought, that's amazing. I don't even know where I parked the car. And here this guy comes alongside, asks how we're doing. And he didn't get invited. He just knew that he needed to show up. He's a good friend. He was he was a very good friend and still is. And I just remember that when I got in his car and sat in the passenger seat and he started to drive me home, I just broke down. I realized that all the shock and everything that followed and the tension, it just hit a breaking point. And I realized that if I had tried to drive home, I don't think I could have made it anyway. And I'll just never forget that in the midst of a deep period, a tough period, along comes a friend, comes alongside and says, how are you doing? And I think that is one of the lessons that we see in scripture, but also just in life. And it's something we have to remember. But I should also, something comes to mind. I should also remember that there was a lot of help from a lot of people in the recovery period when Brenda was in a kind of a hospital bed. She had to wear a body cast to get up. So that was a difficult period as well. And I'll never forget the ladies of Brentview, how they rallied. They, Milton, Linda Olhauser, Ed and Miriam Sardachuk, the Elsassers, the Olhausers, all kinds of people brought meals. And, but also Carol McCaslin, Shirley Friesen, Lois Updegrove, Barb Sardachuk, Sylvia Falk. Many of these people came and also helped with the house cleaning and a whole bunch of things. Like there was literally an army of people that came alongside us and just said, you're going to need this, you're going to need some food. And I just encourage you to remember that as you're helping someone who's grieving, try to come alongside and do some things. There's other passages in here where we see that David had experienced grief. If we go to 2 Samuel chapter 18, we'll see that David had another experience with grief. This time it was his son, Absalom. He had a tough relationship with Absalom. It wasn't easy for him. But then there's another one of these terrible battles. And in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 29, reading through to the 19th chapter, 2 Samuel 19 up to verse 8. Let me read this for you. The king asked, this is David asking, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was. The king said, stand aside and wait here. So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son. Norman Archer in his book suggests that part of it was the guilt that David had experienced over some of the lost relationship with his son, that he was saying, oh, if I'd only had more time. But it was certainly another time of tough grieving. Joab was David's right-hand man. It's one of his commanders. Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son. Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, today you've humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Pretty harsh words here. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now. So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Now, of course, in a tough situation of a loss, we know that eventually you have to get some things done. There are tasks, there's day-to-day living. But really, is that what David needed right at that moment, for his right-hand man to come and say, snap out of it, get going? Now, it turns out that it's what the troops needed, but it wasn't what David needed. In fact, maybe there could have been a combination. Maybe Joab could have come alongside and just done that same thing. How are you doing? What can I do? You must miss your son. Something. And of course, sometimes we don't want to say anything because we're afraid of saying something wrong. And that is a legitimate concern. But to tell someone to snap out of it and hop to it, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. I know that in my own case, I can remember a particular funeral where I was at, and I tend to sit at the back, sometimes kind of maybe even away from people, because I have a hard time. I tend to get quite emotional. I have a tough time, and I don't necessarily want people to see that. I sometimes feel like I need to kind of sit away. But as you know, I'm a person who likes to talk and talk things out, and I sometimes process my thinking through talking to someone. The conversation is a real ointment for me of healing in a way. And I know that often in a funeral, I'll have the somber part in the sanctuary, and then I'm on my way over to the gym to enjoy some of the fellowship. And I often will look for a table where there's some, maybe even a bit of laughter, which of course seems odd after a funeral. But often people are sharing happy memories, and I'll want to join in because I want to talk about that too. And that's kind of my way of processing grief. But there are other people, they just want to be quiet. They want to be alone with their thoughts, or at least not say a lot. And I made the mistake of coming out from the sanctuary where the tough part was, and then heading for the fellowship part, running into someone and starting to chat and doing what I do, which is to talk. And it was very clear this person was not there. And I realized later that I had hurt that person by talking about something else. And it wasn't right, but I felt bad, but that's how it went. And I realized that people, and this came out in our small group, people process grief in different ways, and it takes time. And I know one of the things that we do sometimes is to try to get the person thinking about something else, maybe an upcoming motorcycle trip or whatever it might be, as we deal with it. So even though we might not be so rough as Joab here and tell someone to hop to it and snap out of it, I think sometimes we do come alongside and then we try to talk about something else to distract the person, to get them thinking about something else. And it's not all bad. I just encourage all of us to be sensitive to where the person is at and sometimes come alongside and just be willing to be quiet. I have a friend whose dad passed away. He was older, but his last days he fought COVID and he lost his battle with that. And I remember calling up my friend and talking to him about it, and you could tell that it was very painful, not just because of the loss of his father. He was in his 90s, he was definitely older, but it still was a shock. It was still tough. And as I was chatting with him, all of a sudden, we're on the phone, and there was complete silence, which of course is awkward. And so I realized I needed to let that silence. He was just so broken about all this, especially how the last days went with not being able to see his dad. In those days, it was the early days of the virus, and he wasn't able to get in until the very last minute, and he found that very hard. So here he is on the phone, kind of breaking down, and there was silence, and that's awkward. But sometimes that's what people need. They just need a quiet moment with a friend nearby. And so then I remember trying to talk to him, not with any real wise words. I didn't have that many wise words, but I talked to him a little bit to kind of break the silence. And the next day, he sent me an email thanking me that I was just there. And I think that's one of the key things. Um, so we have to be careful. Sometimes it requires action. Like I think of my friend that came to the hospital. I didn't call, but he knew I needed help. Sometimes we need to step in and do something, but sometimes it's just to come alongside and talk to the person. Jesus did that. If we look at Luke 24, it's just after the resurrection, and you can imagine what the disciples must have been going through at the time. They had everything looked so amazing, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, so many people fed, so many people healed. Things were on the up and up, and then all of a sudden there was this crucifixion, and everything was their master was gone, their rabbi, their friend, and these disciples were now walking on the road to Emmaus. So it's Luke 24, verses 13 to 27. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked alongside them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still. Their faces were downcast in grief. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one living in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in the last few days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. A lot of confusion, I'm sure. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Think about that for a minute. His disciples were in a deep state of grief for more than one reason. And he walks alongside, and what does he do? He starts to talk about the scriptures. In other words, as he came alongside, he tried to get the disciples to look up, to think of heavenly thoughts. And that's not easy to do in the midst of your grief. But I know that I was suffering through some loss, and somebody came up to me and reminded me that my grandmother was in heaven, and I needed to take comfort in that. And I remember, I think I was still in the shock phase because I didn't respond very well, but they were right. I needed to look up. And that's what Jesus was trying to do. And I thought of an example. It's a little bit weak. You'll have to work with me. Be patient with this illustration, but just think about this for a minute. Imagine that you've gone to England like Ron and Mary did, and you've rented a car, and of course you've got to sit on the other side and shift with the other hand. And Ron was driving a standard. And I'm just amazed that he made it through England, driving a small standard car through those busy streets. But imagine you're in a car like that. You've rented a car. You're with your family, and it's late at night, and it's raining, and you're lost. You can't find your way back to your B&B, and you're kind of going around in circles. And all of a sudden, you're driving past Buckingham Palace. Again, work with me on this idea a little bit. But your car breaks down, the rental. Your cell has quit, and now you got the hood up, and you're near Buckingham Palace, and you don't know what to do. And of course, this is very hypothetical. But imagine one of the palace guards comes over and says, "How's it going here? Can I give you a hand?" And then you explain the problem to him, and then just imagine again, use your imagination that the palace guard says, "Well, I'm authorized, actually. I have to check with my superior, but I'm authorized to allow you to come inside the gates here, and we can maybe help you in there, and you can maybe find a phone." And so, I mean, you can't believe this. You're 1 minute you've got kids that are crying, and your car's broken down, and it's late, and you're lost, and everything seems to be going wrong, and all of a sudden everything seems to be going right. A palace guard invites you in. As the palace guard is explaining this all to his or her supervisor, the queen happens to be in the hall and overhears this. I mean, again, this is an imaginary thing. Imagine that the queen overhears this and says, "Oh, well, they can come in here." And you are escorted into one of the guest rooms in the palace. You walk past all this amazing artwork. You see the guards, and then you come into this room, and they've lit the fireplace, and they've turned down the beds, and of course your clothes are soaked. They've brought extra clothes. And then they say, not only can you stay overnight, but tomorrow morning you're going to have breakfast. And maybe the king, the queen and Prince Philip come by and say hi or something, or maybe they're just there. But can you imagine how you would feel if you were 1 minute having car trouble, the next minute you wake up and you're in the palace? That's a little bit like what we can remember in our grief. We have struggles on earth, and they're not small. You know as well as I do. And we've lost lots of good friends here in our discovery class group over the last year or so. I'm not going to list them all because I'd probably forget somebody, but there are definitely people that I miss very directly. But one day we're going to wake up in heaven, and it's something that I think we need to recall, even though sometimes it still hurts at the time. It's good. Let me close with Isaiah. It's the 40th chapter. And I think it kind of ties into what Jesus did with the disciples in order to try to come alongside, ask them how they're doing, and then try to get them to look up. Isaiah does the same thing. It's Isaiah chapter 40, 28 to 31. And it says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall." But this is the key part of the verse here. "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint." Isn't that a great promise? And isn't it interesting that in a way it's kind of backwards? When we're grieving, we try to get through that time period of the rough period, and we try to kind of start to take some steps, a few steps, and then walk, and then maybe run. Look at this verse. It says, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles." In other words, if we can somehow in our grief, if we can come alongside people and help them gently and with sensitivity to look up, maybe they'll soar with the eagles. And then they'll come down and hit the ground running, and then maybe they can start to walk and they will not faint. And that's, I think, our challenge with the grief that we've experienced, and especially in these times where we can't gather as much as we'd like. I think we need to come alongside, a phone call, a text, an email. And in some cases, not a lot of words because often we don't know the right words. And we need to come alongside people and just try to help them to look up so that they too can soar as an eagle as they think about that time when we'll all be together soaring like eagles. So today is probably a little less so than the time that we normally have with Ron, but I can only think of so much because it's a tough topic, and I don't know all the answers to grief. And in fact, as I think back to Norman Archer's book, the opening part of the book, he says, if you're looking for a formula for a grief, some way to handle it all, he says there's no formula. It's tough slugging, but I think a few lessons from David and from Isaiah we can look up. But it's kind of traditional at the end of our discovery class to have a little story of some kind, and I'm going to do that today too. But I'm going to go back to this book, Tales from My Little Black Bag. It's fascinating what doctors have to go through. At one point, his own son got sick, and even though he was interning in the hospital and his wife was a nurse there, he gets a bill for more than 1.5 times his annual salary for the care for his son. He had to go take on other work besides his daytime job at the Vancouver General Hospital in order to try to make ends meet. It was not easy it's never easy being a doctor. They have long hours and so much responsibility, and it's just a fascinating book. But I went to my mom and dad and I said, tell me more. He was our doctor, wasn't he? And they said, he sure was. And what I didn't realize is that it's coming up in a couple of weeks. My mom was celebrating her first wedding anniversary, my mom and dad. They had been married exactly 1 year, but my mom was in the hospital at the General Hospital. And she'd been laying flat on her back for 2 or 3 days, right around her anniversary. And she was 2 weeks overdue with me. And my dad was getting very worried, and the doctor was getting very worried. But they had heard about, they all knew, the doctor anyway, knew about this guy at the General Hospital that helped in obstetrics named Dr. Iverson. And they said, he's a bit of an expert on this stuff. We're going to call him in because something is wrong. Dr. Iverson came in, and it was on May 29th, and he said, we have to get this lady into OR immediately. And they needed to do an emergency C-section. But Dr. Iverson was very honest with his patients, compassionate. But he said to my dad, he said, we don't know exactly how this is going to go. We might lose the baby and we might lose your wife, but it's the only thing we can do. And my dad said, well, of course. And anyway, they did the C-section and everything turned out fine. I'm still here. But I couldn't believe it when I found the book about that doctor. And then I asked my mom and dad about the story. And so, yeah, this spring, it'll be 64 years that Dr. Iverson saved the life of my mom and me. And I just want to thank you for your time today.